The year is 1946. Havana glows like a jewel in the Caribbean night, a city of cigars, rum, and rhythm. From the balcony of the Hotel Nacional, the waves crash gently against the Malecon, and the sound of laughter spills from the casino below. Amidst the scent of tobacco and perfume, a man stands apart from the noise. He is impeccably dressed, dark suit, silk tie, eyes sharp with calculation. His name is Charles Lucky Luciano. He is a king without a kingdom. Once, Luciano ruled the underworld of New York, the architect of modern organized crime. He turned chaos into order, transformed gangsters into businessmen, and rewrote the rules of the American Mafia. But tonight the empire is gone. The man who once commanded armies of killers and kingmakers now lives in exile, banished from the land he conquered. He stares out into the Havana night, wondering if he has truly escaped, or if his past has followed him across the sea. Havana offers the illusion of freedom. In this city, American mobsters move like ghosts among diplomats and movie stars. The casinos buzz with energy, the hotels hum with jazz and whispers of backroom deals. It's a paradise built on corruption, and for Luciano it feels familiar, almost comforting. But beneath the glamour lies danger. Every handshake hides a blade, every smile conceals a scheme. Luciano has come here for more than pleasure. Havana represents his last chance to reclaim power. He believes he can rebuild from exile, unite the scattered pieces of his criminal empire, prove that even deportation can't kill his influence. He is here to remind the world that Lucky Luciano is not finished. But something in his eyes betrays the illusion. The years of prison have aged him. The confidence remains, but behind it sits fatigue, the weight of too many betrayals, too many ghosts. He's surrounded by allies like Meyer Lansky, men who owe their fortunes to him. Yet he senses their distance, their careful calculation. To them he is no longer the boss, he's history. As the camera moves through the hotel corridors, we glimpse the underbelly of paradise. Suitcases filled with cash, telephones crackling with coded messages, secret meetings in smoke-filled rooms. The Cuban officials, the American mobsters, the gamblers, they all orbit around Luciano's presence, yet each one prepares for the moment when the legend finally fades. There is poetry in his downfall. Luciano's story is not one of a clean break, but of exile, a man torn between nostalgia and necessity. He wants to believe he can shape destiny again, but deep down he knows he's chasing a ghost, the ghost of his own empire. The American Mafia has moved on. The commission he built now belongs to others. His name, once whispered with reverence, is now invoked with caution. And yet, as the night deepens over Havana, there's still magic in his presence. He radiates authority, that quiet kind of power that doesn't need to be spoken. Every glance from the bar staff, every nod from a passing mobster acknowledges it. Lucky Luciano may have been exiled, but he hasn't been erased. The scene fades into slow motion, the flicker of a cigar lighter, the shimmer of roulette wheels, the sound of a saxophone blending with the ocean breeze. Over this, a voiceover poses the question that will drive the story: can a man who built his life on power ever live without it? This is not the story of Lucky Luciano's rise, that tale has already been told. This is the story of his exile, his attempt to hold on to meaning when the throne is gone. It's a journey through Havana's casinos, Naples' alleyways, and the final years of a man who refused to fade quietly. From Havana to hell, this is the story of Lucky Luciano's exile, redemption, and the ghost of a king who could never truly die. It was supposed to be freedom, but for Lucky Luciano, freedom came with chains you couldn't see. In February 1946, after nearly a decade behind bars, the man who had once ruled America's criminal empire stepped off a ship in Naples, Italy. The U.S. government had commuted his sentence on one condition: permanent deportation. To the world it looked like a deal, mercy for service rendered. To Luciano it was exile. He had left America in silence, forbidden even to say goodbye to the city that had made him. As the ship crossed the Atlantic, the skyline of New York, the city he'd conquered, faded into mist. For years he had imagined what freedom would feel like. Now he realized that freedom meant never setting foot in his empire again. Naples greeted him not as a homecoming hero but as a stranger. The war had left Italy in ruins, bombed out buildings, black markets thriving in desperation, people surviving on cigarettes and hunger. Luciano, dressed in tailored suits, stood out like a relic from another world. He had left America as a boss. He arrived in Italy as an exile, watched by police, hounded by reporters, and haunted by ghosts. Everywhere he went, the shadow of his reputation followed. To the Americans, he was the father of organized crime, the man who turned street gangs into a global enterprise. To the Italians he was something darker, an unwanted export, a reminder that even their exiled sons could bring corruption home. The Italian press called him il re dei gangster, the king of gangsters. But Luciano knew that kings without kingdoms are only stories waiting to end. He tried to convince himself that this was temporary. He told his few trusted associates that exile was just another business problem, a challenge to be managed. You can deport a man, he said once, but you can't deport his brain. Yet inside he felt the emptiness of separation, from New York, from the people who had once feared and revered him, and from the invisible machinery of power that had once obeyed his word. In Naples, his days became a strange blend of luxury and loneliness. He lived in fine apartments, ate in expensive restaurants, and received visits from curious journalists and foreign businessmen. But he was always watched. Italian police stationed agents outside his home, American intelligence kept files on his movements, and even the local mafia treated him with caution. The irony was cruel. The man who had once built a system of secrecy and control now lived under constant surveillance. Every letter was opened, every phone call logged. His image appeared in newspapers across the world, the exiled godfather, the ghost of New York. But inside the silence, something stirred. Prison had taught Luciano patience, and exile would teach him adaptation. He began to see opportunity where others saw ruin. Italy's post-war black markets were thriving, cigarettes, morphine, luxury goods. In a country starved of order, chaos was currency. And Luciano understood chaos better than anyone. Still, something inside him was shifting. The arrogance that once defined him had softened into reflection. He often walked the narrow streets of Naples alone, dressed elegantly but without guards. Locals would stop and stare, they knew who he was, and some would cross themselves quietly as he passed. He didn't smile often anymore. The fire that had driven him as a young gangster was dimmer, replaced by an awareness of mortality. In rare moments of candor, Luciano spoke about America like a man speaking of a lost love. He missed the rhythm of New York, the streets where deals were made and enemies were buried. America was my university, he once told an Italian friend. Everything I learned, business, respect, power, I learned there. But America had expelled him, and the mafia he'd created had begun to evolve without him. Behind closed doors he wrote letters to old allies, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello and others. The letters were coded, careful, and often sentimental. Things change, he wrote in one, but men like us, we find a way. To his old partners, it was both reassurance and warning. To Luciano it was a lifeline, a way to pretend that he was still part of the empire he'd built. As months turned into years, Luciano realized that exile had done more than separate him from America. It had made him irrelevant. The new generation of mobsters didn't need the old traditions. They were faster, colder, and more ruthless. The commission, the council of bosses he had created, now moved without consulting him. Vito Genovese, once his subordinate, was rising in his absence. Luciano could feel the shifting tide of power, and for the first time he knew what it meant to be obsolete. And yet he refused to vanish. His pride wouldn't allow it. They think I'm finished, he said to a confidant in 1947, but I'll show them. I built the system. I can rebuild it anywhere. It was more than defiance, it was survival. As the sun set over the Bay of Naples, Luciano would sometimes stand on the balcony of his apartment, watching the ships drift in from America. He would imagine the smell of Manhattan streets, the sound of Broadway at night, the hum of the city that had once belonged to him. But no matter how vividly he imagined it, he knew that world was gone. The king was alive, but his kingdom existed only in memory. And yet, deep within that memory, a new plan began to form. A plan that would take him from the ruins of Naples to the glamour of Havana. If he couldn't return to America, perhaps he could bring America's underworld to him. The exile was over. The reconstruction of power, the ghost empire, was about to Naples, a city of contradictions. The smell of espresso and salt water fills the air, mingling with the scent of decay from bombed-out buildings. Children run barefoot through the rubble, chasing American soldiers for chocolate bars. Black markets thrive in alleyways where sunlight barely reaches. This is the Italy that welcomed Lucky Luciano, a kingdom of ruins waiting for someone bold enough to rule its shadows. Luciano's ship docked quietly one winter morning. The port was alive with merchants, thieves, and the desperate poor. To the Italian police waiting on the dock, he was not a returning son. He was a problem. Their orders were clear. Watch him, document him, never trust him. Luciano had been exiled as a criminal, but in Naples he arrived as something more ambiguous, both legend and threat, both exile and symbol of power reborn. He rented an apartment overlooking the sea, modest by his standards though still elegant, with marble floors and a grand piano he never played. Every morning, he dressed impeccably, as if he were still in New York attending business meetings instead of pacing the same few rooms under surveillance. He knew the police were listening through the walls, but he didn't care. The performance mattered. Luciano understood better than anyone that image was power. Naples fascinated him. It was a city where laws existed but were negotiable, where the government struggled to rebuild and survival depended on connections. Every port, every dock, every smuggler represented an opportunity. America had stripped him of his empire, but Italy offered raw material for a new one. And in that chaos, Luciano found his stage. The first to reach out to him were the Camorristi, members of the Neapolitan underworld older than the Mafia itself. They approached him cautiously, half in awe, half in suspicion. To them he was an American myth, a man whispered about in jail cells and taverns. But Luciano's presence unsettled their balance. He didn't ask for permission. He asked for possibilities. The post-war years had turned Naples into one of the most lucrative smuggling hubs in Europe. Cigarettes, morphine, silk stockings. Whatever people wanted, someone could get. The Americans stationed in Italy were desperate for luxuries, and Luciano knew exactly how to turn desperation into profit. He began forming quiet partnerships with local brokers and smugglers, using old Mafia connections to move goods from Sicily and Marseille. Officially, he was a retired businessman. In reality, he was mapping the arteries of a new underworld. Yet this was not the confident Luciano of 1930s New York. The years had changed him. Exile had made him more cautious, more calculating. He no longer needed to pull triggers or shout orders. His greatest weapon was suggestion. A nod, a rumor, a favor. Power delivered through silence. Naples was the perfect place for such a man. A silent kingdom, where influence was invisible but everywhere. To the outside world, Luciano played the role of a reformed man. He told journalists he wanted to live quietly to enjoy his remaining years. He invited friends to dinners at his favorite restaurant, Teresa, on the harbor, always polite, always charming. But beneath the small talk, plans were unfolding. Money began to move discreetly through banks in Switzerland and Cuba. Messages traveled between Naples and New York via intermediaries. Slowly, the exiled Don was reweaving his invisible web. American intelligence was watching closely. The Office of Naval Intelligence and later the CIA believed Luciano was re-establishing drug routes from Europe to the U.S. Whether those suspicions were true or exaggerated didn't matter. The myth of his control became as powerful as control itself. Every rumor of a heroin shipment out of Naples carried his name, whether he ordered it or not. That ambiguity suited him. "Let them think I'm still in charge," he told an associate. "Fear does half the work." The local press couldn't get enough of him. They wrote about his tailored suits, his careful manners, his mysterious meetings. In a country emerging from fascism and war, Luciano was the perfect antihero. A man who had defied governments and built an empire out of nothing. Italians, weary of chaos and corruption, both despised and admired him. To many he represented the shadow side of ambition, the part of human nature that refused to submit. Still, Luciano's inner life was marked by restlessness. Nights in Naples were long and filled with ghosts. He would sit by his window, staring at the lights of ships leaving for America, imagining the city that once belonged to him. Every sound of a passing car made him think of the detectives watching. Every knock on the door made him wonder if it was another interrogation. Freedom had never felt so much like imprisonment. Despite his growing influence, Luciano knew Italy would never truly be his. The Mafia in Sicily viewed him as an outsider. The Camorra in Naples saw him as competition. And the Italian government wanted him gone. In the summer of 1947, the police raided his home, seizing documents, letters, and cash. They found little. Luciano was too careful, but the message was clear. He would never be allowed peace here. He responded the only way he knew how, by expanding the game. If Italy rejected him, he would look elsewhere. The Caribbean, perhaps. Somewhere close enough to America to taste it again. Somewhere where money and power spoke louder than governments. Naples had taught him one thing above all. Exile did not mean defeat. It simply meant adaptation. The city had given him perspective, a laboratory for reinvention. From these narrow streets and smoky cafes, he began to imagine something bold. A new empire built not on fear of law but on manipulation of geography. If he couldn't rule in New York, he would rule from the shadows, from across the sea. The next chapter of his life was waiting just over the horizon. The word was spreading quietly among his old allies. Lucky's coming back. Not to America, but close enough to touch it. His new kingdom would rise from a different shore, one lit by tropical sun and casino lights. That kingdom would be called Havana. By 1947, Lucky Luciano's exile in Naples had settled into a strange equilibrium. He was both trapped and untouchable. The police trailed him daily, yet no one dared to move against him directly. His power no longer came from soldiers or street corners, it came from whispers, the kind that traveled across oceans, through coded letters and trusted emissaries. In that silence, the old empire began to stir again. Luciano had always understood one truth about power: it doesn't vanish, it migrates. When he was deported, he didn't lose control entirely, he simply lost proximity. The men who once looked to him for guidance, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, still owed him favors, money, and a debt of respect. And though he was half a world away, his presence lingered in every deal, every whispered conversation in New York's back rooms. The reawakening of his influence began with letters. Simple, short, written on expensive stationery and mailed through intermediaries in Switzerland and Cuba to avoid American censors. To anyone else they looked like personal notes, polite, almost banal. But between the lines were instructions, coded references to shipments, meetings, and mutual interests. The old networks, gambling operations, labor rackets, and smuggling routes, began to hum again, slowly but unmistakably, under his distant direction. His greatest link to the American underworld was Meyer Lansky, the quiet, calculating financier who had once been his partner in turning crime into commerce. Lansky respected Luciano not just as a friend but as an architect. Where others saw exile, Lansky saw an opportunity to expand globally. The two men shared a vision: to make the Mafia an international syndicate, a corporation of vice with no borders. Lansky began acting as Luciano's ambassador. He visited Havana, New York, and Miami, using his legitimate businesses as cover. To anyone watching, he was a respectable casino investor. But in private meetings he was relaying Luciano's thoughts, strategies, and blessings. "Charlie still thinks long-term," Lansky would tell his associates. "He's in Italy but his head is in Havana." It was through Lansky that Luciano began hearing about new opportunities in the Caribbean. Cuba was transforming. Casinos, nightclubs, and tourism were booming under President Ramon Grau and later Fulgencio Batista. The Mafia saw a goldmine waiting to be tapped, and Luciano wanted in. The island was close enough to America to feel familiar, yet far enough to escape its laws. But before Havana, there was work to be done in Europe. Luciano needed to prove he still mattered, that he wasn't just an aging relic. Through discreet partnerships with local smugglers, he began helping coordinate the movement of contraband goods across the Mediterranean. Everything was unofficial, denied, and untraceable: cigarettes, liquor, morphine base from Turkey that would later feed the heroin trade. Whether Luciano masterminded the operation or merely allowed his name to be used is still debated. But one thing was clear: when his name appeared in rumors, doors opened. The Americans took notice. FBI files from the late 1940s describe Luciano as continuing to exercise influence over organized criminal activity from abroad. The CIA, newly formed and hungry for intelligence, viewed him with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Some within the agency still remembered Operation Underworld, the secret wartime deal that had involved Luciano's cooperation with U.S. naval intelligence to secure New York's docks during World War II. Now those same channels were quietly asking, could he be useful again? To Luciano the attention was validation. It meant they still feared him. And fear, he knew, was the purest form of respect. But the network wasn't easy to control from afar. He relied on a delicate chain of trust: old allies, new intermediaries, and a few ambitious young men looking to make their names. In his absence, others had begun to reshape the Mafia's future. Vito Genovese, who was consolidating power in New York, and Albert Anastasia, whose reputation for violence was rewriting the rules Luciano had once established. Luciano could sense it: the tone of his empire was changing. The cold discipline of his era was giving way to greed and spectacle. And yet he couldn't resist the pull. "Once you've built something like this," he reportedly told a confidant, "you can't let it run wild. You have to remind them who started it." That reminder would come not through violence but through presence. If he couldn't step foot in America, he would bring America's underworld to him. He began floating the idea of a summit, a meeting of the Mafia's top minds, away from the eyes of law enforcement. A place where he could reassert his vision, restore order, and remind the young bloods what the organization truly meant. Meyer Lansky supported the idea wholeheartedly. The timing was perfect. Post-war prosperity was filling the casinos and nightclubs of Havana with money, and the island's government was more than willing to look the other way in exchange for a cut. The Mafia needed a neutral ground, and Cuba, just 90 miles from Miami, offered paradise with plausible deniability. While Luciano couldn't travel directly from Italy to Cuba without attracting suspicion, he began moving pieces quietly. Associates in Mexico, Florida, and the Caribbean started laying groundwork for his eventual arrival. Letters hinted at a reunion of old friends and a celebration of progress. It was a diplomatic mission disguised as nostalgia. But as plans for Havana took shape, cracks began to form beneath the surface. Some of his old allies, particularly Vito Genovese, saw Luciano's resurgence as a threat. Genovese had ambitions of his own, to dominate the New York Commission and rewrite the legacy Luciano had left behind. Behind polite words, a quiet war was brewing, one of influence, alliances, and whispers. Luciano, for his part, underestimated how much the game had changed. From Naples he could see the chessboard, but he could no longer touch the pieces. His authority was symbolic, his reach limited by oceans and watch lists. Still, he believed symbols had power, and Lucky Luciano was the ultimate symbol. By 1940's end, the message had traveled through every major Mafia family from New York to Chicago. Lucky's back in the picture. The whispers had crossed borders, outpacing the truth, blurring it. Some believed he was running Europe's heroin trade. Others said he was advising Lansky's gambling empire. The details didn't matter. What mattered was belief. And belief, in this world, was currency. Luciano was no longer a man of the streets. He was something more dangerous, a myth directing traffic from the shadows. The legend of Lucky Luciano had survived prison, deportation, and distance. Now it was gathering strength again, preparing to step out of the fog of exile and back into the world stage. The stage would not be New York. It would be Havana, the city where a ghost would try one last time to reclaim his crown. Before Havana, before the exile, there was a secret deal, one that blurred the line between criminal and patriot, sinner and savior. It was the moment Lucky Luciano became something more than a gangster. He became a ghost asset of the United States government. The year was 1942. The Second World War had come to America's shores in the form of fear and paranoia. German submarines prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships just miles from New York Harbor. Rumors spread that Nazi agents had infiltrated the docks, that sabotage was inevitable. And in those chaotic months the U.S. Navy faced a terrifying question: who really controlled the ports of New York? The answer was not the government. It was the Mafia. Luciano, sitting in Dannemora prison at the time, still commanded respect on the docks through his old lieutenants. The unions, the stevedores, the men who loaded and unloaded the cargo, they all answered to the same quiet power structure that Luciano had built years earlier. To fight the Axis, the Navy would have to make a deal with the devil. That deal would become known, in whispers and declassified files, as Operation Underworld. The proposal was simple. The U.S. government would seek cooperation from the Mafia to secure the docks, root out potential spies, and ensure the steady flow of war materials. In exchange, Luciano would receive better prison conditions, and perhaps, one day, leniency. It was an arrangement no one could publicly acknowledge, but everyone understood. Desperation makes strange allies. It began with a man named Meyer Lansky. Lansky, ever loyal, acted as the bridge between Luciano's world and the U.S. Navy's intelligence officers. He arranged quiet meetings with mob-connected dock bosses and assured them that cooperation was a patriotic duty. He even convinced the volatile Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner of Murder Incorporated, to play along. The Mafia would protect the docks, silence rumors, and keep the supply lines running. In return, Luciano's name was quietly transferred from the blacklist of public enemies to a far more discreet ledger, the one reserved for useful men. From his prison cell, Luciano coordinated through intermediaries. He gave his blessing to the plan, and his word was enough. The violence on the docks subsided almost overnight. The sabotage that the Navy feared never materialized. To the intelligence officers who had doubted him, it was proof of something unsettling. The Mafia could be more efficient than the state. Years later, skeptics would argue that Operation Underworld was exaggerated, that Luciano's role was inflated by rumor and self-mythologizing. But even if the scope was small, the symbolism was monumental. The United States had used a criminal mastermind to defend its most vital asset. And for Luciano, the irony was exquisite. The same government that had branded him a monster was now depending on his control to keep the nation safe. But every favor has a cost. When the war ended, Luciano's lawyers began lobbying for his early release, citing his patriotic service. The request reached the desk of Thomas E. Dewey, the very prosecutor who had once sent him to prison. At first, Dewey refused. Releasing the most powerful gangster in America would be political suicide. But the pressure mounted. Naval intelligence vouched for Luciano's wartime cooperation. Prominent figures hinted that the man had earned a measure of mercy. Finally, in 1946, Dewey signed the papers. Lucky Luciano walked out of prison, his sentence commuted, not erased, but shortened in gratitude for his assistance to the government. The catch: he was to be deported immediately. No return, no appeal, no empire. Luciano accepted the terms with a smile, but inside he understood what had happened. He had been used. America's war was over, and so was his usefulness. They had needed him when the docks burned, but now they wanted him gone, out of sight, out of memory. He left the U.S. as both patriot and pariah. The papers portrayed him as a redeemed villain, gangster aids the war effort. But behind the headlines the FBI fumed. J. Edgar Hoover, who had long refused to acknowledge the Mafia's existence, now saw Luciano's release as a humiliation. To the Bureau it was proof that corruption ran deep, that power could always find a loophole. To Luciano the episode left a bitter taste. In his mind he had served the country that had raised him, and the country had repaid him with exile. "I helped them win their war," he told an Italian reporter years later, "and they threw me out like garbage." The psychological wound went deeper than politics. For the first time in his life, Lucky Luciano had played by someone else's rules, and lost. He had bent his will to a higher cause, believing it might buy him redemption or at least respect. Instead, it bought him passage on a ship to nowhere. In exile he would replay those events in his mind, torn between pride and regret. The man who had once ruled New York's underworld had tasted what it meant to hold invisible power, to influence a nation's security from a prison cell. And yet, that same influence had exposed his vulnerability. It was the beginning of a new paradox for Luciano, the paradox of the exiled Don. He was too valuable to destroy, too dangerous to embrace. Governments and gangsters alike would treat him the same way, useful when needed, disposable when convenient. Still, Operation Underworld had proven something that even his enemies couldn't deny. Lucky Luciano understood systems, legal, criminal, or military, better than most of the men who claimed to control them. He could see their pressure points, their dependencies, their fears. And so, when he finally arrived in Naples, stripped of status but not of knowledge, he carried with him the one weapon that exile couldn't take away, the understanding that every power structure, no matter how righteous, is built on deals made in the dark. It was a lesson that would guide his next move. If governments could bend the rules for survival, so could he. If America could trade its soul for victory, then so could Lucky Luciano. Operation Underworld had shown him the price of patriotism. Now, in Havana he would learn the price of ambition. By late 1946 the world was changing, and so was organized crime. The war was over. America was booming. The streets that once ran on bootleg liquor now pulsed with cash from construction, gambling, and post-war optimism. But beneath the bright lights of prosperity, old alliances were fraying. The Mafia, once unified under Luciano's vision, was drifting toward chaos. And so, from his exile in Naples, the exiled king began to move his pieces again. Lucky Luciano knew he could never set foot in the United States. But that didn't mean he couldn't rule near its borders. The answer came in a place drenched in sunlight and sin: Havana, Cuba. Havana was perfect, exotic yet accessible, corrupt yet orderly, a tropical mirror of New York with better weather and looser laws. American mobsters had been investing there for years, using the casinos and hotels as legitimate fronts. And presiding over this growing paradise of vice was Luciano's old friend and financial genius, Meyer Lansky. Lansky had been cultivating Cuba for years, charming its politicians and building relationships with its strongman, Fulgencio Batista. With the right bribes, the island could become a legal sanctuary for gambling, narcotics distribution, and laundering money. Batista, pragmatic and greedy, understood perfectly. If the Americans wanted to spend money, Cuba would provide the tables. In late 1946, Lansky sent word across the Atlantic. The time had come. A grand meeting, a conference, would be held in Havana. It would gather the most powerful figures in organized crime, the bosses from New York, Chicago, Florida, and beyond. And at the head of the table, the man who had built it all, Lucky Luciano, would preside. The logistics were a masterpiece of deception. Luciano couldn't travel directly from Italy to Cuba without arousing suspicion, so false passports and discreet arrangements were made. Officially, he was visiting Mexico on business. In reality, a private vessel brought him quietly to Havana under the cover of night. When he stepped onto Cuban soil, it was the first time in over a decade that he was within reach of the empire he'd created. The Hotel Nacional de Cuba, a colonial palace overlooking the ocean, became the stage for the most legendary underworld summit in history. The lobby buzzed with disguised power, businessmen in linen suits, actresses, and politicians mingling with men who had once ruled America's streets. The hotel staff didn't need to be told who these men were, they could feel it. The air itself seemed to vibrate with danger. At the top floor, behind closed doors, history unfolded. Luciano entered the suite like a monarch returning from the dead. The room fell silent. Even men like Frank Costello and Albert Anastasia, predators in their own right, stood in quiet acknowledgement. For years, rumors had spread that Luciano was finished, that Exile had turned him into a myth. Now here he was in the flesh, calm, poised, and smiling. The meeting was business, but it was also ceremony. It was about reaffirming loyalty, restoring order, and redefining the future. Luciano began with grace and authority. He thanked everyone for coming, reminded them of the foundation they'd built, and spoke of the new opportunities in the post-war world: gambling, narcotics, Hollywood unions, Havana itself. His words carried the rhythm of command, calm, measured, absolute. Meyer Lansky, sitting nearby, translated those words into action. He presented charts, numbers, and projections, proof that Havana could become the new financial heart of organized crime. The city's casinos would be controlled, taxed, and shared. No more gang wars, no more unnecessary blood. Business would rule. The bosses nodded. The old dream of the commission, Luciano's corporate vision for the Mafia, was alive again. But beneath the surface of celebration, a quiet storm brewed. Among the guests was Vito Genovese, a man who had once served under Luciano and now sought to surpass him. Genovese had returned from exile in Italy with ambitions of his own, to take control of the New York families and rewrite the balance of power. To him, Luciano was not a savior, he was an obstacle. Throughout the conference, Genovese played the role of the loyal lieutenant. He flattered, smiled, and offered suggestions. But those who watched closely, men like Lansky and Costello, sensed the tension. Genovese's presence was a challenge cloaked as deference. The climax of the meeting came when the conversation turned to Las Vegas and the problem of Benjamin "Bugsy" Siegel. Siegel, another of Luciano's protégés, had been pouring mafia money into a luxury hotel in the desert, the Flamingo. It was meant to be the jewel of organized gambling, but Siegel's extravagance and arrogance had turned it into a financial disaster. Some wanted him dead. Others wanted to give him time. Luciano, ever the strategist, urged patience. "He's one of ours," he said. "He's just thinking too big." But the room was divided. Money had gone missing, tempers were short, and the new generation of mobsters, men without Luciano's code of loyalty, were eager for blood. It was the first sign that the world he'd built was slipping beyond his control. For a few days, Havana became the capital of the underworld. Deals were made, alliances renewed, and photographs discreetly taken. Luciano reveled in it, not the wealth or the women but the recognition. For a brief, electric moment he felt like himself again, the boss of bosses, the architect of a global empire. Outside the hotel, the Cuban nights burned with jazz, rum, and danger. Mobsters danced with movie stars, politicians drank with killers, and the scent of easy money filled the air. Luciano watched from his balcony, cigarette glowing in the dark, as if surveying a kingdom reborn. But deep down he knew it was an illusion, paradise on borrowed time. American authorities soon learned of his presence. Reports began circulating that the exiled gangster was in Cuba, holding court among the world's most dangerous men. The FBI pressed the U.S. State Department for action, and Washington leaned on the Cuban government. Batista, ever the pragmatist, understood the message. Havana could not afford a scandal that risked its lucrative American ties. Luciano's stay, once celebrated in whispers, became politically toxic overnight. Within weeks he was told, politely but firmly, that he had to leave. It was over almost as quickly as it had begun. As he prepared to depart, Luciano looked around the grand halls of the Hotel Nacional one last time. He had come to reclaim his throne, and for a fleeting moment, he had succeeded. But like a ghost returning to haunt his own palace, he could not stay. The empire would continue without him, and the men he had once ruled would soon begin carving it into pieces. When his plane lifted from Havana's runway, the Caribbean sun flashing off its wings, Luciano knew the truth. This was not a return. It was a farewell. The Havana Conference would become legend, the last gathering of the Mafia's old guard, the final moment when Lucky Luciano's voice could still silence a room. He had built the commission, reshaped the Mafia, and even outwitted the U.S. government. But time, more than any enemy, had defeated him. Havana had given him a throne for 1 week. The world would never give it back. When Luciano's plane lifted off from Havana, he carried with him more than just memories, he carried the scent of betrayal. In that final week in Cuba, he had felt it, a change in tone in the eyes of the men who used to call him Charlie. There was respect still, but no longer fear. The empire he'd built from blood and intellect was shifting, fragmenting under the weight of new ambitions. And at the heart of that quiet mutiny stood one man, Vito Genovese. Genovese had always been patient, even when rage burned in his veins. Years earlier, when Luciano had been arrested and sentenced, Vito saw opportunity. But his own exile to Italy during the war had delayed his rise. Now, with Luciano gone and the New York families hungry for new leadership, Genovese began his campaign to take back what he believed was rightfully his, total control. To understand how dangerous that was, one must understand the psychology of both men. Luciano was a strategist, a man who believed in equilibrium, in power balanced by profit, in rules that kept chaos at bay. He had founded the commission precisely to avoid the kind of blood-soaked instability that had defined the old mafia wars. Genovese was the opposite, a man who thrived on fear, manipulation, and brute force. Where Luciano had seen crime as business, Genovese saw it as domination. He didn't want to run the mafia like a corporation. He wanted to be emperor. Back in Italy, Luciano began to hear disturbing reports. Genovese was undermining his allies in New York. Men who had once been loyal to Lucky were now being pressured, blackmailed, or quietly eliminated. Frank Costello, Luciano's longtime confidant and a stabilizing force in the organization, suddenly found himself the target of assassination attempts. Albert Anastasia, the unpredictable killer, drifted between alliances. Even Meyer Lansky, the calm, calculating financier, kept his distance, sensing that the new generation was playing a far more dangerous game. From Naples, Luciano tried to maintain control through letters and messengers, but he was fighting shadows. He could no longer walk the streets of Little Italy, no longer whisper in the right ears. He was a strategist without a board. He watched as the commission, his creation, began to rot from within. The idea of unity that had once made the mafia invincible was dissolving into factions. Profit gave way to paranoia. And Genovese knew exactly how to exploit it. In 1947, with Luciano still in exile, Genovese began circulating rumors. He whispered to the underbosses that Lucky had grown soft, that exile had turned him into an irrelevant relic. "He's done," Genovese told anyone who would listen. "Italy's his prison. He can't control us anymore." But there was more. Genovese hinted that Luciano had become an informer, that Operation Underworld, that murky wartime deal with the U.S. Navy, was proof he had collaborated with the government. To the superstitious and prideful men of the mafia, that was the ultimate sin. Luciano's name, once synonymous with loyalty and control, began to be spoken in lowered voices. Some called him the old man, others the ghost. Even in Havana, word reached his allies that Lucky's influence was waning. Meyer Lansky tried to defend him. "Without Charlie," he reminded them, "none of us would be sitting here." But money and fear talk louder than loyalty, and the mafia had entered a new era, one ruled not by codes but by hunger. Meanwhile in Italy, Luciano tried to build a life amid the ruins. Naples was still scarred by war, its alleys crawling with desperation. He rented an apartment overlooking the bay, surrounded by the beauty of a country that had never felt like home. Every morning he'd sit by the window, cigarette in hand, watching ships pass, each one a reminder of the world he'd lost. He tried to stay busy. He opened small businesses, dabbled in export ventures, and even entertained local politicians who saw him as a figure of intrigue. But inside he was restless. The old instincts never died. The calls kept coming, coded messages from New York, whispers of opportunities in South America, the narcotics trade in full bloom. And that's where Genovese saw his opening. He began expanding into the international drug market, building routes from Turkey to New York through Italy and France. Luciano, ever the pragmatist, initially resisted getting involved in narcotics. He believed it was too risky, too visible. But as his control slipped, so did his restraint. If Genovese was going to profit off drugs, Luciano would too, if only to prove he still could. It became a shadow war waged through couriers and coded telegrams. Each man tried to outmaneuver the other across continents. Luciano used his connections in Naples and Sicily to intercept shipments and control ports, while Genovese tightened his grip on New York's distribution network. The profits were massive, and so were the consequences. By the early 1950s, American and Italian authorities began to notice a pattern. Shipments of heroin were flowing from Europe into the U.S., through routes tied to men associated with both Luciano and Genovese. Newspapers began calling it the French Connection. To law enforcement, it was a crisis. To the underworld, it was evolution. Organized crime was now truly global. But for Luciano, the new empire felt hollow. He had built the Mafia to be organized, disciplined, efficient. A business of honor among thieves. What he saw now was chaos. Drugs destroying communities, violence spilling into headlines, and men like Genovese turning the code of omerta into a farce. There was a moment, small, almost invisible, when Luciano realized the world had passed him by. It came during a clandestine meeting in Rome, where he sat across from a young Sicilian broker involved in the heroin trade. The man spoke with the arrogance of youth, dismissing the old ways, calling the commission a myth. Luciano listened quietly, then smiled. "Kid," he said, "we built that myth. And it built you." But when the young man left, Luciano's smile faded. For the first time in his life, he felt irrelevant. Back in New York, Genovese finally made his move. In 1957, he orchestrated the attempted assassination of Frank Costello, a symbolic strike against the old guard. Costello survived but stepped back from power. With that, Genovese crowned himself boss. He had won the empire Luciano once ruled, but not its soul. And yet, even in victory, Genovese feared the shadow of the man he had dethroned. Luciano, though thousands of miles away, still commanded a strange reverence. When his name was mentioned, even his enemies lowered their voices. He was no longer a rival to be destroyed. He was a ghost to be endured. That's the paradox of power. When you can no longer hold it, your legend becomes stronger than your reach. In exile, Luciano had lost his throne, but he had gained something more enduring: myth. Genovese might have ruled New York, but Luciano still ruled the imagination. And in the world of crime, imagination is its own kind of empire. Still, the wounds of betrayal ran deep. Luciano would never forgive Genovese, not for the lies, not for the poison he'd spread through the Mafia's veins. And as the years went on, he began plotting not a return but a reckoning, a way to expose the traitor's rot at the heart of the empire he'd once built. For in the underworld, there's only one law more sacred than money or power: never betray the man who made you. By the time the 1950s dawned, Lucky Luciano's world had become a chessboard stretched across oceans. From his apartment overlooking the Bay of Naples, he played his final game, one not of guns and streets but of whispers, couriers, and coded telegrams. The empire he'd built had fractured, yet its arteries still ran through him. Every shipment, every deal, every betrayal, somehow, it all led back to the man in exile. And across the Atlantic, in the dark heart of New York, Vito Genovese was moving to erase him once and for all. This was no ordinary mob war. It was a cold war, fought not with bullets but with influence, manipulation, and reputation. Luciano had built the Mafia on the illusion of order. Genovese was tearing it apart with greed and paranoia. Both men understood that power wasn't just about control, it was about belief. Whoever the underworld believed was the true boss would, in time, become one. Genovese began by reshaping New York. He expanded into narcotics, unions, construction, and even the political apparatus. He installed loyal men in key families, silenced dissenters, and fed the FBI false leads that pointed to Luciano's hand in international drug trafficking. To the authorities, Luciano, still under exile in Italy, became the perfect scapegoat. A ghost running the world's heroin trade. A villain too distant to disprove the myth. And the irony was, Luciano did have a hand in it, though never in the way they imagined. Cut off from the U.S., Luciano sought leverage in the one thing Italy could still offer: proximity to the new drug routes. From Turkey's poppy fields to Marseille's refineries to Sicilian ports, heroin was flowing westward in unstoppable streams. American demand was booming. The profits were astronomical. Luciano, through intermediaries in Sicily and Naples, made sure he got his cut, and used that money to fund his quiet war against Genovese. The two men began circling each other like predators in different jungles, each sending messages across the Atlantic that blurred the line between rumor and threat. Luciano's allies, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and the old guard bosses, began to coordinate in secret. They couldn't bring Luciano back to America, but they could bring America to him. Lansky sent emissaries to Europe, carrying coded instructions and sealed envelopes filled with cash. They built what law enforcement would later call the Havana Pipeline, a transnational network of couriers and financiers linking the Caribbean, Italy, and New York. From exile, Luciano still had a hand on the world's criminal pulse, not to control it, but to destabilize Genovese's grip. To Luciano, it wasn't just about money anymore. It was about legacy. The organization he had created, his masterpiece, was being corrupted. Genovese's arrogance was poisoning it. The balance between business and brutality, which Luciano had once so carefully designed, was collapsing. He began to see himself not as a gangster, but as a guardian of an ideal, a dark kind of order that, in his mind, had once kept the streets cleaner than the politicians ever could. The conflict reached its peak in 1957, at a fateful gathering in upstate New York, the Appalachian Meeting. Genovese, newly self-declared as the boss of bosses, had convened the Mafia's elite to formalize his supremacy. But Luciano and Lansky's network had other plans. Through a series of leaks and quiet manipulations, word of the meeting reached law enforcement. What happened next became one of the greatest humiliations in Mafia history. Police raided the meeting, arresting dozens of mob leaders as they fled through the woods in silk suits and Italian shoes. Newspapers splashed the images across front pages, Mafia leaders caught in upstate raid. For the first time, the American public saw proof of an organized national crime syndicate, and the FBI could no longer deny it. Behind that chaos, Luciano smiled. He hadn't fired a single bullet, but he had struck the deadliest blow of his career. Genovese's dream of becoming the undisputed Capo dei Capi was shattered. He became a public symbol of organized crime, his power reduced, his credibility damaged. Within a year, Genovese would be indicted for narcotics trafficking, a case that many insiders believed had been engineered by Luciano's allies. It was Luciano's revenge, silent, surgical, poetic. But victory came at a cost. The Appalachian fiasco didn't just expose Genovese, it exposed everyone. The FBI launched a full-scale war against organized crime, targeting every family, every operation. The code of silence, omerta, began to crumble. Wiretaps, informants, and federal task forces started unraveling the very fabric of the underworld. Luciano had wanted to destroy one man, but in doing so, he'd set off a chain reaction that threatened the thing he'd spent his life building. He felt it in Naples, the way the air itself had changed. The letters came less frequently. The money arrived slower. Old allies stopped writing altogether. And the new generation, the ones who'd grown up in the shadow of his legend, no longer saw him as a leader, but as a ghost from another era. He began to turn inward. Nights at his seaside home became long and restless. He'd pour a glass of wine, sit by the window, and stare at the lights of ships moving toward America. They think they're free, he'd mutter, but every man's chained to something: money, power, pride. Visitors who came to see him often described him as reflective, even philosophical. He spoke less about the Mafia, more about human nature. "There's no good or bad," he once told a journalist, "only strong and weak. But the strong die just the same." Still, the war between him and Genovese wasn't quite over. Even from prison, where he'd end up serving a sentence after his drug conviction, Genovese tried to reach Luciano, to reconcile or perhaps manipulate him once more. Luciano ignored the letters. "He can rot," he told a friend. The snake ate its tail. By the early 1960s, both men were relics of an age that no longer existed. The Mafia they had built and fought over had evolved into something more corporate, less personal. A system run by committees and accountants, not visionaries or killers. Luciano watched from afar as the FBI dismantled his old empire, one indictment at a time. The hidden war, the one fought through deception and distance, had ended. But it left behind scars that neither man could erase. Genovese would die bitter and powerless behind bars. Luciano would die in exile, his name immortalized but his soul tired. In the end, neither had truly won. What survived was not their power, but their legacy, a lesson carved into the DNA of organized crime, that every empire built on secrecy eventually collapses under the weight of its own lies. Luciano's war against Genovese was never really about territory or money. It was about something deeper, the fight to define what power meant. For Luciano, power had always been control through balance. For Genovese, it was domination through fear. And in their struggle, the Mafia had chosen its future: chaos over order, greed over code. The hidden war was over. The world Lucky Luciano had built was slipping into history. And the man who had once ruled it all was left alone with the one enemy he could never outsmart: time itself. Every empire, no matter how cunningly built, eventually turns on its architect. For Lucky Luciano, the fall did not come with the echo of gunfire or the clang of a prison gate. It came slowly, like a long shadow creeping across the Mediterranean. By the early 1950s, his exile in Italy had begun to feel less like a sentence and more like a slow suffocation. At first, Luciano tried to treat exile as a new kind of power. From his seaside villa near Naples, he entertained visitors from New York, oversaw business interests in Europe, and spoke with the confidence of a man who still believed he could control the world through conversation alone. He dressed impeccably, hosted lavish dinners, and carried himself as though he were still the chairman of the board of organized crime. But beneath the surface, the empire was disintegrating. The Havana dream had evaporated. Genovese's betrayal had fractured the commission. Old allies like Frank Costello and Albert Anastasia were either retreating or turning paranoid. Luciano's influence was now symbolic, a myth that others invoked for legitimacy, even as they ignored his words. And the authorities, both in the U.S. and Italy, never stopped watching. The FBI had branded him the mastermind of international narcotics, while Italian police shadowed his every move, hoping to catch him coordinating the drug trade between Europe and America. To them, Luciano wasn't a man, he was a symbol of global corruption. But the truth was more complicated. Luciano was involved, yes, but not in the way they imagined. He had no laboratories, no dockside operations. What he had was influence, a network of loyalty and fear that allowed him to skim profits and settle disputes, even from afar. Yet even that fragile power began to crumble as the narcotics trade drew unwanted heat from governments on both sides of the Atlantic. Then came the betrayal that broke him. In 1954, one of his trusted associates, a courier named Enrico Tomeo, was caught smuggling heroin. Under interrogation, Tomeo mentioned Luciano's name. Whether out of fear, manipulation, or ambition, his testimony painted a vivid picture of Luciano as the puppet master behind a massive drug empire. The newspapers seized on it instantly. "Exiled mob king controls global heroin ring," screamed the headlines. For Luciano, it was the ultimate humiliation. He had once prided himself on being untouchable, a man who moved behind the curtain, unseen. Now his name was splashed across every front page in Europe. The image was devastating. The legendary mob boss, reduced to a caricature of greed and corruption. Worse still, the United States began pressuring the Italian government to act. American officials accused Italy of harboring the world's most dangerous criminal. Under intense diplomatic pressure, the Italian Ministry of the Interior began monitoring his every step. His phones were tapped, his mail opened, his movements documented. He was summoned for questioning repeatedly, not as a suspect but as a reminder that he was still under watch. Each visit to the police station chipped away at his pride. "I'm not a gangster anymore," he told a friend in frustration. "I'm an old man they can't forget." But deep down he knew the truth: the world would never forget him because it couldn't. He had become the face of organized crime, both for those who loved him and those who wanted him destroyed. Luciano's attempts to go legitimate only deepened the irony. He invested in small businesses, tried to build a chain of cosmetic stores, even flirted with movie rights to his life story. But each time he tried to step into the light, the shadow of his past dragged him back. The police would arrive, reporters would swarm, and the deals would fall apart. To be Lucky Luciano was to be both famous and imprisoned, a living myth trapped in his own legend. Meanwhile, the criminal landscape he had designed was changing beyond recognition. The narcotics trade, once a side operation, had become the Mafia's main artery. Young, ruthless men with no memory of prohibition or omerta were taking control. They didn't respect the old rules, the careful balance Luciano had once enforced. They only cared about profit. From his apartment window, Luciano could see the changes in the faces of those who came to visit. The old respect was gone, replaced by opportunism. They called him Don Lucky out of habit, but their eyes said something else: "You're finished." He could feel himself becoming irrelevant in real time, his advice treated like the ramblings of an old general who no longer understood the battlefield. "These kids," he said once, shaking his head, "they think being tough is the same as being smart. They don't know the difference." But the real knife came from a direction he didn't expect, from the United States government itself. In 1957, after the Apalacan fiasco humiliated the Mafia, federal investigators leaked declassified details of Operation Underworld, the wartime deal that had helped secure Luciano's early release. Overnight, the man once seen as the embodiment of loyalty was painted as a government collaborator. The word traitor began to circulate in the underworld, whispered by those who had never known him but envied his legend. Luciano was furious. "I never betrayed my people," he told an Italian journalist, pounding his fist on the table. "I did a favor for America when they begged for it. They begged." But the nuance didn't matter anymore. In a world built on myth, perception was power, and Luciano's myth was turning against him. The once invisible man now found himself cornered by two enemies, the law and his own reputation. The irony was cruel. The system that had made him famous was now suffocating him, and the organization he had built for order was now using his name as a cautionary tale. He began to withdraw from the public eye, spending more time alone in his villa. Friends who visited said he seemed tired but defiant, still meticulously dressed, still sharp. He would speak for hours about the past, not with nostalgia but with calculation, as if reviewing a chess match that had ended in stalemate. At times he spoke like a philosopher, not a gangster. "You can control men," he told one visitor, "but not time. That's the real boss." By the late 1950s, Lucky Luciano was no longer feared, no longer even hunted, just watched. He had become a relic of his own legend, a ghost the world refused to let rest. The newspapers still called him the capo of all bosses, but the men who now ran the streets barely knew his face. The fall had come quietly, without drama or blood. No betrayal in a smoky backroom, no gunman waiting in the dark. Just the slow erosion of relevance, the cruelest death for a man who once ruled the underworld. Yet even as the world moved on, Luciano was already thinking of his next move. There was one final act left, not to reclaim power but to reclaim his story. If he couldn't control the Mafia anymore, he would control the myth. And in doing so, he would find one last chance to write his own ending. For most men, the trial of their life takes place in a courtroom. For Lucky Luciano, it unfolded across continents, in headlines, government dossiers, and whispers that reached every corner of the criminal world. His judges weren't just prosecutors or politicians, they were history itself. By the 1950s, the world no longer saw him as a man, but as an emblem, the face of organized crime, the ghost of prohibition, the myth that refused to die. And that myth was now on trial. When the United States government branded him the world's most dangerous criminal, it wasn't an accusation, it was a declaration of war. They couldn't arrest him anymore, he was safely exiled in Italy, but they could destroy what was left of his legacy. Newspapers ran stories claiming Luciano was behind every major narcotics shipment between Europe and America. Senators invoked his name during hearings on organized crime. Even J. Edgar Hoover, who had once refused to acknowledge the Mafia's existence, now used Lucky Luciano as proof that it was real and international. Luciano became the bogeyman of the Cold War era, a figure whose shadow stretched across oceans and into American paranoia. To the press, he was no longer a man, but a symbol of moral decay, the proof that evil could organize itself, wear a suit, and profit from human weakness. But behind those headlines was something more personal, a vendetta disguised as justice. In both Washington and Rome, there were men who couldn't stand the idea that Luciano had outsmarted the system. He had humiliated prosecutors, corrupted politicians, and escaped America's reach through a legal loophole called deportation. He had beaten the House, and in the eyes of bureaucrats and lawmen alike, that was unforgivable. So they began to build their case, not in a courtroom but in the court of global opinion. Italian investigators, under pressure from American counterparts, launched a campaign to tie Luciano to the booming heroin trade. They traced shipping manifests, intercepted coded telegrams, and arrested small-time traffickers who invoked Luciano's name for protection. Each time the evidence was circumstantial, a rumor, a meeting, a payment. But when compiled, it created the illusion of a vast conspiracy with Luciano at its center. An illusion, after all, had always been Luciano's greatest weapon. Now it became his greatest curse. In 1958, the Italian government called him in for formal questioning. The scene was almost absurd, a frail but impeccably dressed man sitting across from grim-faced prosecutors, who treated him as if he were still the emperor of a vast criminal empire. Luciano denied everything calmly, even humorously. "I've been retired for years," he said with a smirk. "If I had that kind of power, I wouldn't be here answering your questions." But his charm no longer worked. The world had changed, the rules of power had shifted. Where once corruption had been whispered, now it was televised. Cameras waited outside the courthouse, reporters jostled for position, and every photograph of Luciano entering or leaving became another headline. Mafia King still pulls the strings from exile. He was trapped in a paradox. Too famous to be ignored, too notorious to be believed. Every denial only fueled suspicion. Every smile looked like arrogance. The real trial wasn't legal, it was existential. In a sense, the sentence had already been passed years earlier when he was deported. Exile was his prison and reputation his warden. But now the bars were tightening. Italian authorities imposed travel restrictions, forbade him from leaving Naples and monitored his mail. Friends were interrogated, associates harassed. Every visit, every phone call, every handshake was recorded. The man who once moved unseen through the alleys of New York could no longer walk to the corner cafe without being followed. It wasn't the law that broke him, it was the humiliation. To the world, Lucky Luciano had always represented control. A man who commanded loyalty with a glance, who could broker peace between killers, who could bend chaos into order. Now he was being treated like a petty criminal, a suspect in his own myth. The Italian police even raided his home once, seizing letters and photographs as evidence. Luciano watched in silence as officers rifled through his private memories, snapshots of a life built and burned by ambition. When they left, he poured himself a glass of wine, lit a cigarette, and stared at the smoke curling toward the ceiling. "They think they're punishing me," he said softly. "But they're just proving I was right. Power scares everyone even when you don't have it anymore." Despite the pressure, no formal conviction ever came. The evidence was too thin, the connections too indirect. Luciano remained free, technically innocent but publicly damned. It was a victory that tasted like ash. He had escaped prison but not persecution. The system couldn't cage him, so it buried him under reputation instead. The trial of Lucky Luciano never ended with a verdict. It simply faded into bureaucratic silence. No judge slammed a gavel, no jury returned a decision. But the world had already decided. In the eyes of the press, of governments, and even of his own organization, Lucky Luciano was guilty of being too powerful for too long. For Luciano, that realization marked a turning point. He stopped fighting the accusations and began accepting the inevitability of his myth. "They made me the devil," he told a reporter, "so I learned to wear the horns." It was a dark kind of liberation. If the world insisted on seeing him as the architect of organized crime, then he would own that title, but on his terms. He began speaking more openly about his role in shaping the Mafia, not as confession but as correction. "We didn't invent crime," he said once. "We just gave it structure." Those words, recorded by a journalist and later repeated in countless documentaries, became his closing statement to history, not a plea of innocence but a declaration of authorship. By the time the investigations ended, Luciano's health was declining. His heart was weak, his body slowed by years of tension and insomnia. But his mind remained sharp, haunted yet alive. He would sit on his terrace overlooking the sea, cigarette in hand, and reflect on the trial that never was, the one that had been fought in newspapers, courtrooms, and the conscience of a nation. In his own way he had beaten the system again. Not by winning but by outlasting it. There would be no prison, no official sentence. Just the slow erosion of a man who had once ruled the shadows, and now lived inside them. Lucky Luciano's real punishment was not exile, not accusation, not even isolation. It was immortality. Because once you become a legend, you never truly walk free again. For most men, prison is the end of the story. For Lucky Luciano, it was merely another chapter, a throne behind walls, a kingdom without borders. When he entered Clinton Correctional Facility in 1936, sentenced to 30 to 50 years for compulsory prostitution, many believed it was the last they would hear of him. But Luciano didn't see prison as confinement. He saw it as containment, a new arena where influence, not freedom, was the currency. The headlines at the time were triumphant. District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey, who had built his reputation on bringing down the mob, called it the end of an era. Newspapers showed mugshots of Luciano with the caption, "Vice King Caged." Yet behind those gray walls in upstate New York, the man once called the boss of all bosses began to rebuild something that looked eerily like an empire. Luciano understood one thing better than anyone. Control wasn't about proximity, it was about communication. And even in prison he could communicate. Guards could be bought. Messages could be smuggled out through lawyers, relatives, or coded letters. In a system already riddled with corruption, Luciano found pathways others couldn't even see. He began modestly re-establishing contact with his old allies, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis. Each message carried orders, advice, and reassurance. Keep the commission running. Maintain balance. Avoid wars. The empire would not collapse while its architect was alive. Even in confinement, Luciano's aura grew. To inmates he was a figure of myth, polite, composed, untouchable. Guards spoke of him in whispers, referring to him as Mr. Lucky or the Gentleman. He refused to act like a criminal, and that contradiction made him magnetic. He kept his cell tidy, read newspapers daily, and insisted on maintaining routines of power, dressing sharply, walking with dignity, holding himself like a man who expected respect. But there was another layer beneath the calm, a deep, simmering anger. The trial had humiliated him. Dewey's prosecution had painted him as a predator, not a strategist. The empire he built with vision and intellect was reduced in court to a vice ring. For a man who had turned crime into an art of governance, it was an insult. In the quiet hours of his cell, Luciano replayed every step of his downfall, every betrayal, every word of testimony. The name that haunted him most was that of his own associates who had turned state witnesses. Betrayal, in his world, was the one crime that could never be forgiven. But he couldn't strike back, not from behind bars. His revenge, if it came, would have to be through patience and precision. And then, unexpectedly, came the war. When World War II erupted, it changed everything. The U.S. government suddenly found itself facing a terrifying vulnerability. German submarines prowled the East Coast, threatening vital shipping lanes. The docks of New York, controlled by Italian and Jewish mobsters, were a potential point of sabotage or salvation, depending on who held the leash. And that's when Luciano saw his opening. Through intermediaries, particularly Meyer Lansky, he offered a deal. The Mafia would help protect the docks, prevent strikes, and provide intelligence from Sicilian contacts, in exchange for leniency. At first, it sounded absurd, a government partnership with the mob. But wartime desperation makes strange bedfellows. Operation Underworld, as it was later known, became one of the most secret and morally complex alliances in U.S. history. While Luciano remained in prison, his influence orchestrated cooperation between naval intelligence and organized crime figures. Sabotage attempts stopped. Ships began moving safely. And when Allied forces invaded Sicily in 1943, Luciano's connections provided critical local intelligence and support. Inside prison walls, he had become a silent player in a global war. By 1945, his name had gone from enemy of the state to unofficial asset. Even J. Edgar Hoover, who despised organized crime, had to acknowledge, albeit privately, that Luciano's cooperation had yielded results. And so, the conversation about his fate began to shift. Governor Dewey, now a national political figure, faced pressure to reward the cooperation that had helped the war effort. Publicly, he couldn't be seen as soft on crime. Privately, he understood that Luciano's continued imprisonment was politically inconvenient. The compromise was elegant in its cynicism. Early release in exchange for deportation. In 1946, after serving only 10 years of his 50-year sentence, Lucky Luciano was granted parole, on the condition that he would be permanently deported to Italy. When the news broke, the world was stunned. "Gang King freed," shouted the New York Daily News. Dewey defended his decision as a patriotic necessity, but many saw it for what it was: the state's uneasy acknowledgement that even its greatest enemy had been indispensable in its darkest hour. As he boarded the ship that would carry him to Italy, Luciano stood at the railing, watching the skyline of New York recede into the mist. He had built an empire there, and now he was leaving it behind forever. Some said he looked proud, others said he looked haunted. Perhaps he felt both. But the irony was unmistakable. Even behind bars, Luciano had exercised more influence than most free men ever could. His imprisonment had not broken his power, it had purified it, distilling his authority into something less visible but more enduring. The Mafia, now fully structured under the commission system he had created, continued to thrive without him, proof of his vision's strength. His allies remained loyal, his enemies wary, and his name, Lucky, became shorthand for survival against impossible odds. In a letter written shortly after his release, Luciano reflected, "They thought they buried me alive. They didn't understand, I don't need to move to make things move." Prison had changed him, yes, but not in the way his captors hoped. It stripped away illusion, leaving only purpose. It taught him patience. The kind of patience that kings learn when kingdoms are lost but crowns remain. When he stepped off the ship in Naples, he was not just an exiled man, he was a phantom king returning to a foreign throne. His body had been confined, but his legend had escaped long ago, growing larger with every whispered rumor of his unseen hand. Luciano had spent 10 years behind bars and somehow emerged more powerful, more mysterious and more untouchable than ever. He had turned prison, the state's ultimate weapon, into his final demonstration of control. And now, with exile awaiting him, the stage was set for his last act. Not the fight for power but the battle for his legacy. When Lucky Luciano boarded the ship that would take him away from America in 1946, the skyline of New York, the city he had once ruled from the shadows, faded into the mist behind him. He stood on the deck as the cold Atlantic wind bit into his face, hands in his pockets, silent. For the first time since his youth, he had no territory, no soldiers, no throne. Only a name that still carried fear, and a mind that refused to surrender. His deportation to Italy was supposed to be the end. The U.S. government had made it clear, he was never to return. To them, Luciano was no longer a man, he was an idea too dangerous to exist on American soil. Yet exile did not destroy him. In many ways it gave him something far more enduring: perspective. When Luciano stepped onto the docks of Naples, Italy, the local press waited for a monster. What they found was a sharply dressed man who smiled politely and spoke with the calm assurance of a diplomat. The Italian police watched him, the Americans tracked him, but nobody could quite define his role. Was he retired? Was he still in control? Or had time finally caught up to him? In the cafes of Naples, whispers began. Men in expensive suits visited him quietly. Letters arrived from Havana, New York, and Palermo. Officially, Luciano was just another deported immigrant living quietly by the sea. Unofficially, he was rebuilding, not through violence but through influence. Within months, Luciano's network stretched across continents. He was in contact with Meyer Lansky, still orchestrating gambling operations in Havana and Las Vegas. Together, they explored ways to re-establish a global operation, one that would use post-war shipping routes to move narcotics between Europe and the United States. To many, this was the birth of the French Connection, the new artery of organized crime that would dominate the 1950s. But Luciano's world had changed. The brutal, blood-soaked streets of 1930s New York were gone. A new generation of mobsters, men like Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, and Carlo Gambino, had risen. They owed their power to Luciano's system, but not their loyalty. In exile, he became both father and ghost, the man whose shadow every boss lived under and the man no one wanted back. Despite being thousands of miles away, his legend still governed the Mafia's internal politics. He wrote letters, made coded calls, and sent trusted emissaries across oceans. His words still mattered. His name still opened doors. But power from a distance is fragile. It depends on memory, myth, and fear. And slowly the myth began to outweigh the man. In 1947, Luciano attempted to reclaim his influence in Havana, Cuba. Through Lansky's connections, he arranged a lavish summit of underworld leaders, an event that became infamous in Mafia lore. It was a gathering of the Commission's new generation, held under the guise of a business conference. Luciano, suave and smiling, greeted men who had once been his soldiers, now bosses in their own right. That night, as Cuban music drifted through the ballroom and cigars filled the air, Luciano made his pitch. He spoke of unity, of structure, of rebuilding the order he had once imposed. For a moment, it seemed the king might reclaim his throne. But word reached the United States, through the press, through government channels, perhaps even through rivals, that Lucky Luciano was back in business. Within weeks, under U.S. pressure, Cuban authorities ordered his deportation. He was escorted onto a plane, furious but composed. His Havana dream had lasted only a few months. Back in Naples, he began to realize that his empire had truly become something else, a machine that no longer needed its maker. His system worked without him. The commission met without his blessing. His old friends sent respect, not allegiance. Age began to soften the sharpness of his ambition. He spent his days walking the streets of Naples, blending into the crowds, watching the port where cargo ships arrived and departed. Occasionally he would sit by the sea, cigarette in hand, and stare toward the west, toward America. He lived in quiet luxury, still wealthy, still connected, but surrounded by ghosts. Many of his closest allies were gone. Bugsy Siegel was dead. Dutch Schultz, murdered decades earlier, remained a cautionary tale. Even Meyer Lansky, the last of the original minds, grew cautious, focusing more on survival than power. Luciano had always been pragmatic, but now his thoughts grew philosophical. In conversations with journalists, priests, and old associates, he began to speak of destiny. "A man can't change what he is," he said once, "but he can decide how long he wants to keep pretending." Those who met him in exile described two different men: the charming, witty elder who told stories of old New York, and the reflective strategist who still calculated every word. He had not grown soft, only patient. He watched the Mafia evolve, more violent and less disciplined, and often remarked that they were forgetting the rules. By the late 1950s, international attention returned to him. U.S. agencies believed he was still orchestrating global heroin trafficking. Italian authorities trailed him constantly but could never catch him in direct action. Luciano played his final role perfectly, half-retired legend, half-suspected mastermind. But time, as it always does, became his final adversary. His health began to fail, and the once untouchable Don was forced to confront the one truth he couldn't control: mortality. In 1962, Luciano agreed to meet a film producer at the Naples airport, a man who wanted to make a movie about his life. For Luciano, it was a chance to shape his own myth one last time, to tell his version of the story. He arrived dressed impeccably as always, dark suit, polished shoes, eyes still sharp. He shook the producer's hand, smiled, and began to speak. Moments later, his heart gave out. He collapsed on the tarmac, surrounded by police and journalists, his body lying beneath the same sky that had watched his rise and fall. He was 64 years old. In death, Luciano found the peace he had never known in life. He was buried in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, New York, the city that had once been his empire. On his tombstone, beneath his birth name, the words were simple: Salvatore Lucania. He had come full circle, from the streets of Palermo to the prisons of America, from the throne of power to the quiet of exile. The empire was gone, but the design endured. And in that final silence, Lucky Luciano's greatest creation, the order of organized crime, continued to breathe, waiting for its next king. Lucky Luciano's name endures as more than that of a gangster. He became the architect of modern organized crime. Before him, the Mafia was chaos, clans ruled by pride and blood. After him, it became a system. His creation of the Commission in 1931 transformed the underworld into a corporate structure, a council of bosses, territories, and prophets, where order replaced vendetta. But Luciano's legacy was not just organizational, it was psychological. He taught that fear fades but reputation lasts. He mastered power through quiet confidence, a man who didn't need to shout to be obeyed. "A man with a gun can kill one man," he once said. "A man with a plan can control 100. His influence spread far beyond New York. The Sicilian Mafia, the cartels, even the concept of global criminal networks, all mirrored his design. The idea that crime could function like capitalism began with him. Culturally, he became myth. Films like The Godfather borrowed his logic: business over blood, power through restraint. He was both villain and visionary, a man who believed that order, even born from corruption, was preferable to chaos. In the end, Luciano's greatest creation wasn't his empire, but his blueprint. It survives wherever structure hides behind loyalty, wherever power thrives in silence. His world collapsed, yet his system endures, in boardrooms, in backrooms, in the psychology of control itself. Lucky Luciano died in exile, but his idea never did. Lucky Luciano's life began in poverty and ended in legend. From Salvatore Lucania, a Sicilian immigrant kid, he became Lucky, the man who built the American Mafia and gave crime a constitution. But his true story is not one of glamour. It is a meditation on control. Luciano gained everything: wealth, influence, fear, but never freedom. Every rise chained him tighter to the empire he built. By the time he died in 1962, his world had changed. The Mafia he'd shaped now ran without him, proving both his genius and his curse. He had created something that no longer needed its creator.